from Berkeley and a master's in education from Harvard, and his previous work, with which I was familiar when I invited him, was on school discipline. So when I invited Richard, I thought, perhaps that's what he would want to talk about, but we say to people that they can talk about whatever they want, whatever is exciting to them at the time, because that's what we'll want to hear about. And as it turns out, he has a new book coming out.
I know all of you have your Harley bikes ready to go, and you set them aside to come in here. I'm grateful for that.
That would be our team.
Good. But so I hope to make your time here worthwhile. This work I'm presenting today is done in conjunction with Josipa Roksa. She is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Virginia, a former graduate of NYU. And this work has been supported by a number of foundations, including Carnegie, Lumina, Ford, and Teagle, and we're grateful for their support that allowed this research to be done. I'm going to be presenting today, as Jay mentioned, findings from a book that's forthcoming. It says fall 2010, but the actual release date is January 18th, 2011. And I'm going to present findings from the book, but also findings from a policy report that's going to be released in conjunction with the book. The book covers student outcomes for the first 2 years of college, and the policy report is going to have findings for the full 4 years of college. And so you'll see both of them today. And just the one thing I would ask you to do is, prior to the book's release January 18th, that not to cite the work or to quote the work. But after that, the more you cite it and quote it and rely on it, obviously, the better. So the research questions I hope to answer today are three. First, are students improving their critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing skills during college? The most basic of questions. Kind of question, are kids learning in terms of these general skills, the 21st century skills, right? Critical thinking, complex reasoning, written communication, the thing that all faculty agree college students should be doing, no matter what the major. They agree on this. They agree that that's one thing that college students should be developing while in higher education. And we don't have a very good answer to that prior to this research. We don't have systematic longitudinal data that's able to address that basic question, are kids learning in terms of general skills? Second, we're going to ask the question, are students' descriptive characteristics, that is race, class, gender, associated with inequality in college learning? Right, a very classic question a sociologist would ask, are there inequalities in higher education, much as we've asked the question of K-12 education and demanded that our K-12 systems close the gaps in learning, close the test gaps between white and blacks. What does higher education look like? And then third, very important question for practitioners and policymakers, what specific experiences in college context are associated with student learning, and to what extent does inequality in learning across campuses? So the question, what matters? Why do some kids improve on these general skills when we measure them longitudinally over time, and other kids don't? What can we do to improve the rate of learning in higher education? Again, questions that we've asked K-12 practitioners and policymakers to consider and to grapple with research findings from educators for decades. But we haven't asked our higher education system to do that systematically. Now, in order to answer that question, I can't rely on federal data that was collected in national probability surveys. I can't pull up High School and Beyond or NELS. Why can't I? Because the federal government hasn't embedded a measure of general skills in their higher education data sets like they've done in K-12 education. And so, instead, I had to create a data set, working in conjunction with, partnering with other people, create a data set on our own to answer those questions. And we did that. We call it the Determinants of College Learning Data Set. Let me tell you about it. It's got a longitudinal design, It starts with kids entering colleges and universities in fall 2005. It measures their learning, their student performance on this measure in fall 2005. We assess them again spring 2007 after 2 years. We assess them again spring 2009 after 4 years. And we also, after we finished college, we surveyed them 1 year out. I'm not going to talk about that today unless you bring it up in a question and answer how they're doing. They're not doing well. But we can talk about it in detail in the question and answers if you'd like. And we're going to survey them again in spring 2011. It's a large-scale study. It's a study that in 2005-2007 included 24 diverse 4-year institutions, no 2-year institutions, 4-year institutions, including large public research universities, small elite residential liberal arts colleges, some historically black colleges, some Hispanic serving institutions, and otherwise. For confidentiality reasons, I'm not going to name them, but I'm going to show you in the next slide how our sample looks like compared to the rest of higher education in America. And you'll see that it's largely representative of higher education in America. We had slightly over 2,000 kids in 2007. By 2009, we had something like 1,600 kids. And we also had a few institutions dropping out and a few that were surveyed in 2005, not in 2007, but came back in 2009. I won't bore you with the details of the sampling for given time constraints. So what's important here is not only the longitudinal design and the national sampling frame, but also as important is the breadth of information collected. We have not just a measure, an objective measure of student performance on this task at 3 time points, but we also asked students to fill out surveys as they went through. And the surveys collect a breadth of information, like the national probability surveys, on social background, the high school they attended, and we asked them to name the high school, and we went back and pulled data on those from government records on the characteristics of those high schools. We asked about high school experiences, AP coursework. We asked about college experiences, college context, and we also collect the transcripts and code the courses they're taking. And then we measure learning with this thing called the Collegiate Learning Assessment. The Collegiate Learning Assessment, the CLA. Many of you don't know what that is, so I also need to, I said I was going to get to the sample, but I think I do the CLA first. Tell you a little bit about what that CLA is. So the CLA measures learning in a way different than many learning assessments. It's not a multiple choice test that attempts to get measures of these complex general skills in a very reductionist framework, fill in the bubbles. Rather, it attempts to assess performance based on giving students an authentic task that they might confront as a college graduate. They are given a set of documents, 5 or 6 documents, that they're asked to make sense of and write a response to them to an individual. Imagine you're an employee, here's a set of documents, write something to your boss. Let me give you an example. Before I give you an example, I should say it was developed by folks at RAND and psychometricians at Stanford, including Rick Shavelson, the former dean at Stanford Ed School. And I would call it, I think there's problems with it, limitations to it, but I would call it the state-of-the-art instrument for higher ed assessment. And I would say that in part because the OECD, who's been measuring student performance in elementary and middle schools cross-nationally for decades, TIMSS, PISA, in 2016 they're going to do it in higher ed. They're going to go to college students cross-nationally and say, can you do this thing? And tell us a little bit about your college context. And when that comes out, my friends, I'm afraid that, that resting on our laurels, that we have the best higher education system in the world, And I do believe we have the best doctoral programs in the world. I do believe that. But that all of higher education is under that halo, I think it's going to be called into deep question. So let me give you an example of the CLA. This is a real example that's been released. Kids are given this. It's all on a computer. You are the assistant to Pat Williams, the president of Dynatech, a company that makes precision electronic instruments and navigational equipment. Sally Evans, a member of Dynatech's sales force, recommended that Dynatech buy a small private plane, a Swiftair 235, that she and other members of the sales force could use to visit customers. Pat was about to approve the purchase when there was an accident involving a Swiftair 235. Then, the students are provided with a set of materials, newspaper articles, federal accident report, email exchanges between Dynatech and the company, the Swiftair company, descriptions and performance characteristics of the AirSwift 235 and another model, and some other documents. And they're asked to prepare a memo that addresses several questions, including what data support or refute the claim that the type of wing on the Swiftair 235 leads to more in-flight breakups, what other factors may have contributed to the accident and should be taken into account, and their overall recommendation about whether or not Dynatech should purchase the plane. It is not a simple performance task. You have to interrogate the evidence in front of you, the validity of the newspaper report, compared to the FAA report, compared to the email exchanges. You have to synthesize the information, and you have to write on it in a persuasive way. It is not a simple task, but I believe it comes pretty close to what we want our college graduates ideally to be able to do. That when confronted with a task like this coming in, they might struggle, but going out 4 years later, they're going to perform in a much better way. Now, there are these multiple choice instruments out there, CAP and MAP, CAP developed by the ACT and so on. There's been construct validity research that shows that all these have a pretty high rate of reliability across instruments. But this one in particular I find very interesting and appealing for someone with kind of my perspective on what higher education should accomplish. Now here I told you the sample. I don't want to waste too much time on this, but if I were you, I'd be skeptical. First of all, who are these 24 colleges and universities? Is this data representative of anything? And we attempted to answer that question. Which, we go to this one in front or the one in the corner? Where are you looking?
They're the same.
They're the same. Okay, we'll go to the corner. Go to the corner. The CLA, this is our sample of the 24 schools and the characteristics of the kids in it. And we compare it to the second column where we pulled up IPED's government data on kids in those schools to see whether or not we really got a random sampling of kids in the school, or we got a little creaming going on, that the institution said they were random sampling, but they gave us the best and brightest kids. So the first two columns speak to that. We noticed that there are places where there are some differences worth noting here. First of all, gender. Our sample has fewer men than at the schools. We think that's because participating in the project was voluntary, and we believe that female students are much more likely to comply with authority than our male students. Male students are not, we have a problem in our country more generally about boys, and we think it's consistent with this data, but nevertheless we have fewer boys than is representative. Keep that in mind. There's some selection going on there. Race is pretty much looking the same, right? We're not getting the white race is about the same. The other races are off a little bit. Most importantly, the creaming question, you can look at the test score data. And we looked at the data in a couple ways. You look at the SAT performance at the 25th percentile and SAT at the 75th percentile. At the 75th percentile, the top three quarters, the numbers are almost identical. We did not get the top quarter of, our sample isn't skewed for only having kids at the top. At the top, it looks pretty much like kids at that school. However, at the bottom, we don't have kids at the bottom. Our 25th percentile is considerably higher than the government reports. That is possibly the result, again, of that the test requires volunteering and compliance. These kids on the bottom were struggling. It's also possibly our sample here is kids that are still in school 2 years later. Some of these kids might have dropped out. For whatever reason, we don't have kids at the bottom part of the distribution. We believe that if that is going to introduce bias into our study, it introduces bias in a way that we are likely over-reporting the good news in higher ed. We're over-reporting the good news. We don't have the kids at the bottom. So our estimates of things like hours studying, reading, and writing requirements are probably slightly inflated. And wait till you see them. The second and third column here is we can compare the 24 government reports on the 24 schools in our sample to the government reports of schools nationally. And there you see, without exception, they're identical. Our 24 colleges and universities look just like higher education in America in terms of institutional characteristics. There are no differences there. Okay, let's get to the data. We asked kids in their spring of their sophomore year. This is, I find, one of the most troubling slides we're going to get. It's a very simple question. We asked kids, how many courses were you taking last semester where you had certain course requirements? How many courses? We started with courses with 20 pages of writing over the semester. How many courses did you take with 20 pages of writing over the semester? The results back were so skewed to 0 that I can't give you an average here. I'll just show you any course. This is just any. Did you take a single course with 20 pages of writing the prior semester? And you'll see that half of the kids did not. Half of the kids were in American higher education and took not a single course the prior semester with 20 pages of reading over the course of the semester. Whoa, we got a little mumbles on that one. Not my class. I got to go check my syllabus. Okay. Next, we asked them how many courses with 40 pages of reading per week. 40 pages of reading per week on average. Again, the responses were so skewed to 0 that here we just collapse it and we show you that a third of the kids, it's 70% there, a third of the kids have not taken a single course with 40 pages of reading in the prior semester. Okay? Large numbers of kids in American higher education, if you believe what they report, and this is consistent, Nessie's been doing this stuff for a while, asking kids what their student engagement is. But then they also, the Nessie surveys that are gone on, over 1 million students have filled these out, 1,000 kids. They also ask a very bad question, I think. They say, how much do you think you learned when you were in college and university? Guess what we learned a lot. We all learned a lot. They also say, however, that they're not reading and writing. So this is totally consistent with those Nessie results. But now that we've got objective measures of learning, it shows the implications of them, I think, in a different way. You can combine them to both course requirements and neither course requirements. For time reasons, I'll just skip through those. They're obvious. Doesn't matter what college and university you go to. Yes, the picture does look better in certain colleges. Here, highly selective colleges, and less selective, broken out by entering GRE scores of the institutions. I told you we did have some elite liberal arts schools. More likely that in those places you're going to get 20 pages of writing and one course at least, and 40 pages of reading. But even there, in the elite part of American higher education, it's not across the board. You're not getting it in all your classes, and many students are even not getting it there. But most of higher education, of course, isn't highly selective. Most of American higher education is here. And unlike Bowen and Bach, The Shape of the River, unlike Massey, all this stuff on elite higher education, this study is not on elite higher education. This study is on higher education in America. Now, Okay, they're not reading and writing. What are they doing? What are they doing? Well, we asked them. And for ease of interpretation, we break it down to something like this. About 15 hours per week. About 15 hours per week, about 9% of your time. We put sleeping in here. It's an over-exaggeration of sleeping, because the kids don't. It's based on 8 hours per night, which is an exaggeration. But attending, so they're probably socializing more. But attending class 15 hours per week, how many hours do kids report studying? How many hours do they report studying? Somewhere between 12 and 13 hours per week. 12 or 13 hours per week. A third of that is studying with friends. So studying alone, preparing for class alone, college kids report 8 hours per week studying alone. And then another 5 with friends studying. Preparing. We're going to show you what studying for friends does for learning. So together, if you add those two together, it's something like 28 hours, best as, at the top scale, 28 hours per week a college kid is working in class and studying for class. Compared, of course, to high school, we have a superintendent of schools here. High school, they're actually in class more than that. And they actually do a little homework. Especially in the recent decade, they're asked to do a lot of homework. And so, not surprisingly, if you look at some of the qualitative research out there, go interview freshmen, what they say, I didn't think college was going to be so easy. I thought it was going to be harder than high school, and it's not harder than high school, it's easier. I didn't know that. Now, that would be a comparison to high school. You might have another question. Historically, is this different than maybe kids never studied in higher education in America, and then that's okay. Or it's not okay, but you would think about it in a different way. Now here, I'm going to show you one slide that doesn't rely on my work, that relies on a set of labor economists at UC Santa Barbara, Philip Babcock and Mindy Martz. And Babcock is a student of Julian Betts, an economist in San Diego. All this stuff is on the web. You can go back and Google it and pull it up. I've actually been in talks where I say that and people do it instantaneously. Please don't wait. You go do it in your office when you get there. He's gone back and looked at collected time use survey data all the way back to the 1920s to today, where you can answer that question. You can empirically find out, is this something different? Is this something different that kids are only spending 8 hours alone, 13 hours if you consider the time with their friends? Is that something different? It is. It is. I'm showing you here data just from the 60s on. I note on the bottom there from the 20s to the 1925 to 1965, the time is about the same. The time on the bottom is time for in courses and studying together. Here I'm just showing you average study hours, not in class. And you see from 1960 on what happens to studying, full-time college students studying in American higher education. It drops in half. Something is going on in the organizational cultures of higher education that kids are working a lot less harder than they were before. Now, I could be very provocative and do a GPA of students, and it would go up at here in the opposite direction. I won't, because that would be putting salt in the wound. But something is going on. It's not, and if your thing is, well, maybe it's just college for all. There are a lot of different kids going to college today. Because they have individual level data, Babcock and Marx, they're able to examine that question empirically, and they say, no, in fact, if you look at all race groups, whites, non-whites, if you look at the college major, maybe this is because people are going to applied majors in business or so on. No, in all majors and all types of institutions, the trend is all the same, down, 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 down. It's not a compositional change in the student body that's driving this. It's something in the organizational culture that's changed. And what that is, we spent a lot of time speculating about in the book, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but we're not going to We're just going to leave that hanging out there. So we can address more of the empirical data. So first, longitudinal test score 205. Let's ask them again in 2007 what the result, how much kids are learning, and we get something in technical terms. It's 0.18 standard deviations growth. That would mean something like if you started at the 50th percentile of distribution and were tested again with a bunch of new freshmen, you'd move up to about 57 percentile, in the 57th percentile. We don't think that's very much, and there's evidence to suggest that, like our studying, there's evidence to suggest from studies that were done in single institutions at 2 time points that the rate of improvement in cognitive growth has gone down dramatically. But another way to look at it that'll really drive the point home is the following. If you say, okay, you got a big sample, 2,300 kids, there's a little noise in the instrument, where would you draw the line of growth that you would say is statistically significant? So it's a little bit more than 0 here because we're the uncertainty, and we're able to then draw the line and say 45% of kids in the first 2 years of college show we would say that there's no evidence that they are improving on this task. 45%. Now, let me go to that's in the book. The policy report is going to include the 4 years of data. Does it get any better? The rate of growth is about the same per semester in the next 2 years, even though the selection, a lot of kids are dropping out. So this is our success story, the kids that are still in. And the rate of growth doesn't increase. And if you did the same exercise for those kids, over 4 years of college, after investing 4 years of time, you find only 36%. You find 36% of kids no statistically significant gain on this measure after 4 years of investment. But is it a problem of the instrument? I'd say no, because you saw what they said they're doing. They're not doing anything. Why would you expect them to improve on this task? They're not reading. They're not writing. They're not doing homework. How you improve on this instrument through osmosis? Right? Now, other evidence for why this is not just the CLA, a problem with the indicator, the CLA, is there is a study that's being done by a guy named Charlie Blake at Wabash, who's using a different instrument. He uses the CAP developed by the ACT, and has a large number of colleges and universities participating. He's got 4 years of data right now, too. He hasn't released that data. He's got 0.40 standard deviation, so he shows less growth even than we do. And again, remember from early on, we don't have the kids at the bottom. We don't have, this is probably upwardly biased, overly an exaggeration of the good news in higher ed. Okay, I think I got your attention. Let's move the conversation a little bit to what they're doing and what the growth is, to factors we can model the determinants of learning, the determinants of improvement on this instrument. We control for their 2005 scores. We control for background characteristics. We control for institutions attended with fixed effects. And you're able to estimate what are the effects of different factors on it. So the first one is, this is a hard one to know exactly what to make of it, because there's a lot of endogeneity in student reports here. But nevertheless, students, when you ask them, do faculty have high expectations in your institution for students like you? Do they have high expectations for students like you? The more likely they are to report high expectations, the greater the growth from 2005 to 2007. Students respond to high expectations, faculty high expectations. Now again, we've got a superintendent from K-12 education here. He's looking at me like, you don't know that? We've been telling our high school and elementary kids for the last decades to have high expectations for kids. But in higher education, we're not necessarily told that. In higher education, we're not trained to teach. There's not much training to teach at all. to be honest, right? You're trained to do research, and then you figure out how to teach. So even basic things like communicate high expectations for your kids is not something that's, I think, you can take for granted in higher ed. Now, this finding here, not surprising, but if you ask kids to both read and write, they actually improve more than if you don't. And it seems like you need to ask them to do both. It's not just one or the other, but in combination they seem to improve scores. Here's another one. Here's something that's not that wouldn't be obvious, and is actually the finding I get the most pushback from colleagues when I present it. But it's an empirical finding. It's not what I wanted to find. I'm a progressive educator trained at Harvard Ed School. I didn't want to, this is what the data tells me. Okay? When we ask kids about studying alone, the more hours they study alone, the greater their gains in CLA performance. Right? Academic rigor, traditional academic rigor, reading, writing, studying, those things matter. Now, however, we also asked the kids whether they studied with peers, how many hours they studied with peers. And you find here, empirically, that the more hours they spend studying with peers is the equivalent of more hours they're spending in fraternities and sororities. The more hours they spend in reporting such activities, their scores are not just flat, their scores go down. It's not just the fact that they're learning less. Their scores go down. Okay? They're drawn away from their academic rigor and the academic activities. Now this is interesting because in higher education for decades, where we've been obsessed with retention, keeping kids in school, the mantra out there is administrators should set up programs through student services to get kids socially engaged to the campus, following Vincent Tinto's work, who conceptually borrows that idea, of course, from Emile Durkheim. That the more engaged kids are, it's not financial hardship, it's not academics problems that lead to attrition, it's the lack of social engagement. Get kids involved, socially engaged, they'll stay. I believe that finding is true. However, that does not necessarily mean that getting kids socially engaged and attached to the campus is going to lead to higher rates of growth. In fact, there's evidence here that it would lead to the opposite, that there would be a cost to promoting social engagement on campuses, a cost in terms of academic performance, academic rigor. It might be a cost we'd be willing to take, but there hasn't been a serious discussion before of the trade-offs to such an approach. These things do vary by college major. I inhabit an ed school half of the time, and so the results for education schools are not very good relative to other institutions. They look a little bit better than business schools in terms of the kids' performance. But in general, it's the traditional liberal arts core of the campus, social science, humanities, science, and math, where they're improving at the greatest rate. Again, part of this, it could be selection into majors, so I'm not going to say this is all just an instructional effect, but part of it also could be that the social science, humanities in particular, are doing things that are like the CLA test, general skills, read, write, think critically. They're doing that a little bit more than elsewhere. Science and math probably aren't. So there, I think the finding, and they're the strongest, is about this academic rigor. Those kids are working harder in terms of hours studying than other kids. But anyway, these are the patterns. It's complicated to interpret the major effects in particular. We try to unpack it in the book. Let me do a couple more things, and then we can get to the questions and answers. I don't know what, let me see what we're doing for time here. Yeah, well, we're running behind.
We're good.
We're good.
Yeah.
Okay. So once, for 2005, now we have data 2005, 2007, 2009. if you're a statistician, you all of a sudden say, oh, hey, I can do some HLM growth models. This is exciting. It can be fun. Model growth and learning over 4 years of college, 3-level models, test scores nested within students, nested within schools, 7,000 observations at 3 points a time, 3,000 students, 27 institutions. Something like that is our data now. This is not in the book. This will be, these findings will be in the report. We basically, here I'm just going to do two things with this 2009 data. We report in the book findings based on class background, class inequality, and race inequality in terms of higher education outcomes. And basically we pull up the data here in the report and it replicates what we found for 2 years, but obviously it's more convincing when you have the full 4 years of data. So let me show you, I haven't showed you yet the inequality results. I'm going to show you them now. Confirms patterns for parents' education. Oh, and then we find a little bit new. Evidence of institutional selectivity mattering is stronger in the 4 years of data. But anyway, I'm just going to show you here just the class and race effects. First, class. This is, we compare, these are scores, predicted scores 2005, 2007, 2009. The dark column is kids that came in, their parents were educated, high school graduates or less, compared to kids whose parents were college graduates or professional degrees. Or sorry, graduate or professional degrees, not college graduates, one step up. And those kids come into higher education unequal, but over time in higher education, it looks like there's a little bit gap here, but that gain is not significant. In fact, the pattern could be described, if you're a pessimist, as a pattern of persisting inequality. They come in uneven and they leave uneven. Or if you're an optimist, you can say, all the kids are learning at the same rate, higher ed's doing a good job in terms of class. Choose your interpretation based on your personality type. What about race? I'm afraid the race effects are much more disturbing. And in particularly the black-white gaps. Here, again, the figure's set up the same way. The race effects in 2005, African American students start further behind than white students. There's a gap. But what's much more troubling here is over time, particularly the first 2 years, but also in general, in 4 years as well, the gap grows. The longer that the kids are in higher education, the more unequal their outcomes are. So they start unequal, but they grow over time. Now, why is that? Again, this is interpretation. Why would we be surprised by that? Why would you ever be surprised by that? In K-12 education, for the last decade, we've been saying, close the gaps. Bring up African American performance. You know, leave no child left behind. Is there been anything akin to that in higher education? Of course not. Let's be honest with ourselves. As faculty are often told the opposite. They're said, spend your time with the most gifted and talented, the top 10% of kids, because those are the most rewarding. Those other kids are going to take a lot of time. Low-performing kids, not about African American particularly, but low-performing kids, they're going to take a lot of time. Limit your attention to them because they're going to get in the way of your research. I think that's the implicit message in higher education. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But I'm quite sure that there's not a dialogue in higher education about closing gaps in learning where you'd expect any result any different than that.
How big is that gap, distributional?
Okay, so these are predicted scores. A standard deviation is 100 and, I'm doing this off the top of my head, 160. 160. So the gap is something like, it's a little bit less than a standard deviation.
Well, that's more.
That's more than this.
207.
The 207 is 1080 to 1200. It's 1200.
Okay.
1200 difference. So that would be a little bit less than a standard deviation. Now remember, there's a lot of selection going into, who are these kids and who are these African American kids and white kids in the first place, who is still around 4 years later. But even with all that selection, these are the patterns that we're getting.
Sorry to jump in again.
Yep.
This is more alarming than K-12 because K-12 we have residential segregation so that blacks and whites are going to different schools quite often.
Yes,
But
more pronounced than in higher education.
But in higher education, mostly students are going to the same institutions. This is not a fixed effect for institution in there, right? Or is there?
Not in this.
But you're also, but even so, you're still controlling for,
Yes.
for
Yeah.
demographic and family characteristics.
Yep. This one.
And these are
one,
kids in the same university.
Yeah.
Okay.
The finding of the grace gap increasing, even when you put in fixed effects for institution, controlling for institution, is clear,
Okay.
and that's in the book. This finding here in this report, I think, doesn't include a fixed effect. I think we in later models add the fixed effect in and see how much of the gap we can close. Institutional sorting is a part of the story, but it doesn't account for all of it, would be another way to say it.
And there's also an attrition effect going on here too.
Yeah, which we don't do anything complex, any sort of complex correction, methodological attempt to correct for that. It's largely just a descriptive study. So you might ask, if you're interested in things like accountability, how much variation is there across institutions? In our data, we find that 23% of growth occurs, different variation in growth is across institutions. Institutions matter. They can make a difference. However, just like in elementary and secondary education, there's much more variation within schools than across schools. So even in the best schools and even in the worst schools, some kids are learning and some kids are not. And so all institutions would do well to look within to see what they're doing right and wrong to improve policy and practice. There are kids everywhere that are learning, and there are kids everywhere that are floating through.
How do the bars on the previous slide relate to how time is used for study? Are you going to show
The race gaps in particular, it's not accounted for if you add in things like reading and writing requirements and hours studying and studying alone together. Those things matter very little in moving the gap. The institutions attended matter more. The college experiences matter less because the mean differences, the difference between black and whites on those measures, it moves around a lot. Some African Americans are better than whites at good things, some they're not better at, and so it's kind of a wash, those measures. In the book, we add variables incrementally and show the decline in that. Actually, I might even have a slide at the end here to show. Can I move on, because I want to get through and pass the race effects. Okay, the college selectivity matters. I'll skip through that. To get to the questions, then I'll start with the question in the back. Summary of findings. Gains in student performance are disturbingly low in U.S. higher education. Learning in U.S. higher education is characterized by persisting and or growing inequality with respect to individual characteristics, particularly race. There's notable inequality in experiences and outcomes across U.S. institutions associated with college selectivity. And U.S. recent college cohort, that's finding I didn't want there, sorry. That's about how the kids are doing today, and I got some slides in the back, but we didn't have time to go into that. So I won't, unless you ask me in the questions and answer about how the kids are doing today, ignore that last point. Conclusions, implications. Policymakers need to spend more time focused on undergraduate education, not just access and retention. Clearly laudable goals. College for all, keep everyone in longer. Those seem good goals, but what about if we're not teaching the kids something while they're there, then it's just a cynical exercise in warehousing. College for all, but they're not learning anything. And that doesn't seem like sensible policy to me. Practitioners need to recognize the extent to which both student experiences as well as institutional differences are associated with variation in learning. You can do things, colleges can do things collectively to increase student learning and for one thing, reintroducing academic rigor in terms of reading requirements, reading, writing, and holding students accountable for preparing for class. There's also, this is just, we've been doing this in K-12 education for decades. we shouldn't have to do this out of our back pocket, cap in hand, go into foundation saying, give us money to cobble together a data set. This should be built in to longitudinal data sets that the federal government is already conducting. And not only should there be additional longitudinal research, one would also recommend some place randomized experimental trials where you gave kids interventions around particular instructional models, and you actually assessed whether or not the learning improved, right? That you didn't base practice and policy on ideology, but that you look for evidence-based assessment on whether particular things like getting kids to study together in groups had the outcomes you thought it might. Okay, we'll skip that slide. Thank you for your time. And there was a question I set aside.
Have you looked at foreign students in the cohort? And if not, what would you expect?
So we didn't explicitly pull out foreign students, although we did pull out, in the book, we do pull out American immigrant kids who reported that their home language was not English. So, there are some differences there, but the differences we're not as confident about them. A large number of those kids are Asian, and our Asian sample in particular is concentrated only in a small number of schools. And the findings for Hispanics, many of whom are immigrants, was inconsistent between the 2-year findings and the 4-year findings. Were slightly different, and it looked from once we got to the 4 years of data that differences between Hispanics and whites there were no real differences. And so I'm not answering the foreign student question, but I give you we can say a little bit about immigrants.
Can you speculate about what kind of results you might get if you looked at when I say foreign students, I mean people who graduated high school in Europe and Asia and they came here?
Well, so this speaks a little bit, I think, to the data that's going to be revealed in the OECD studies of comparative higher education. I do believe countries differ in terms of the cultures they are promoting with their kids in terms of academic commitment and academic engagement. But I would not. But I would not be quick to say America's at the bottom and everywhere else the kids are hardworking. There are countries out there that the data actually, that look like, that I would predict that the kids are spending less time studying in college than they are in America. Italy, for example. Italy has large, overcrowded colleges and universities where the kids hang out there for years, and it's unclear to, I would predict going in that they're going to look worse than the U.S. in terms of their performance on these measures and their self-reports of learning and reading and writing. Now, what about the Asian countries? Japan actually, their higher education system, the kids work very hard to get into it, but then they coast when they're there. China and Korea and Taiwan actually, I believe they continue to do their hard work and they're going to be way past us. And so these findings have a lot to say about kind of global economic competitiveness. Can you compete economically when our colleges are putting out, students like this who are supposed to have 21st century skills? There's also a bigger, maybe more important question than the global competitiveness. Can you have a functioning democracy? Can you have a functioning democracy when the kids that are coming out of college today are no longer really reading and writing and developing critical thinking skills in a way that they did even 2 decades ago? Are they going to be able to engage the news and so on and be able to make informed decisions? And that finding actually scares me much more than the global competitiveness finding. That we're putting out a generation where large numbers of our college kids who should be demonstrating civic leadership are in fact completely disengaged from public affairs, the media, and serious academic engagement while they're in college. I can show you data on that.
So what reforms would you suggest? How could you incentivize professors to hand out more homework and engage their students a lot more?
Right. So in the book, we argue basically that we have a system in higher education is not in crisis. We have this system exactly what all the actors in it want. That no one in higher education today has put undergraduate education high on the priorities. Students and their parents are looking for a safe environment to send their kids to, where they are able to mature and develop socially, and at the same time leave with a credential that is they can trade for labor market success, which up until a year ago was probably true, that credential did give you a good job. The kids want the credential with, most kids, not all kids obviously, but most kids want the credential with the least amount of work. Faculty have been told that for the incentives for faculty is all research productivity. As Boyer's work shows, that model has diffused widely beyond the research university to all sectors in higher education, even liberal arts colleges, residential liberal arts colleges, where the faculty are expected to for promotion, tenure, raises, whatever, to focus on their research. Those are the incentives there. So they want to be left alone. The administrators are focusing on access and retention, and the U.S. News and World Rankings, where getting the higher GRE kids, higher SAT kids